Today I am driving the MG ZR, a car with the reputation that's varied at best. You see, to some, like myself, this is the very poster child of an adolescence well misspent. This was the go-to car for anybody who 20 years ago wanted something small, fast and fun. It was a car that stood at its peak toe-to-toe with greats like the Renault Sport Clio and the Honda Civic Type R, yet now is not experiencing the renaissance of either of those. It was a car well loved by both journalists and owners for the value it provided and also the way that it went, particularly round a bend. Yet now mention an MG or Rover of any description from this era to anybody and the first thing they'll tell you is all the ways in which they go wrong. This is a car that nailed the fundamentals so completely, not only did it outsell everything else in the MG Rover catalogue, it was also the best-selling car in its class. Yet even that was not enough to stop the collapse of its parent company MG Rover just a few years after its introduction. As another member of the British car empire collapsed, it didn't take long for these to disappear from forecourts. And today, 22 years after their introduction, they're at risk of disappearing from the history books too. But I am determined not to let that happen. Sure, to some this may be some old Rover with bits of even older Honda in it, but I love it. So much so that I've actually bought one. Allow me to tell you why. Truth be told, the deck was stacked against the MG ZR from the very beginning. It began life as the Rover 25, introduced in 1999, but that itself was a facelift of the older Rover 200, introduced in 1995. The ZR and its siblings, the ZS and ZT, were for me easily the best thing to come out of the MG Rover group in its dying days. They were the brainchild of the Phoenix Consortium, and were it not for the fact that those same people also saw MG Rover run into the ground while they walked off with a healthy wad of cash in their pockets, I would have said they did the best job that they could. However, that is a tale for another video. The ZR really is the sporty version of the Rover 25, and it follows the badge engineering playbook. So, you've got slightly different bumpers, front and rear, giving the car a more aggressive look. You've got different alloys, and the suspension and brakes are both tuned to give the car a firmer, sportier ride. Power levels were also more generous than that in the Rover, with the top of the line car being the 160 VVC. There was a diesel, which even at the time wasn't particularly well regarded, so really it's the petrol models we're going to talk about today. Another thing not particularly well regarded about these, turning circle. Exactly why, I don't know, but it is bad. A huge thank you to our headline sponsor for today, CarVertical, the super-powered super search that's the perfect ally if you're on the hunt for a car such as this. Though they are great value, any car is only worth what you pay for it if it is what it says, and a CarVertical search will help you make sure that any vehicle you're looking at buying doesn't have a hidden past, including accident damage regardless of write-off status, outstanding finance, theft, or, unlikely as it may be with an MG ZR, use as a taxi. For certain models, they will also give you handy hints and tips and things to look out for so you can make the most sensible of buying decisions. For a special discount on the service, check out my link in the description and comment section down below. This car, brought to me by its lovely owner Rafe, who's actually bought it for a 17-year-old lad about to start driving, is an example of the entry-level 105 model, powered by a 1.4-litre variant of the Rover K series. Yep, that's right, and give yourself a pat on the back if you've just muttered the words "head gasket," because that's just about what everybody does, and then proceeds to completely ignore all of this car's many other fine qualities. The 105 was never the pokiest thing. These aren't particularly heavy, just over a ton, but the car doesn't actually even make 105 horsepower. It makes 103 PS. This being a naturally aspirated 16-valve engine, the torque figure is equally as malnourished, some 91 pound-foot. about 120 Newton meters. This is all sent through the front wheels, as you would expect in a car of this kind, via a 5-speed manual gearbox. There was an automatic ZR, but it was a CVT and available exclusively with the 120 branded engine, which is a 1.8 litre version of the K series, same as the 160, but does without the VVC variable valve timing. According to many in the know, that is the one to have. To say that these are faultless cars would certainly not be true. They had plenty of issues. Take your pick of the build quality. The sills on this are beginning to break away. Many are well known for corrosion. You have the notorious head gasket failure that afflicts all K series, and that's to say nothing of the fact that basically every MG Rover of the time has an interior that just disintegrates on its own. And things were made even worse when the management, desperate to try and stop the failure of the company, initiated something called Project Drive, where they began to claw out every single little thing from these cars they thought they could get away with removing. And this includes fairly significant stuff, like for example spare wheels, insignificant things like remote releases for the boot, a little piece of trim that's not on the dash here and is on my own. All the models were affected. Then in 2004 they were all facelifted. For some cars it was more successful. The ZS, I think, in facelift guise is quite a handsome beast, but the ZR, I think, was always the prettier car in original form, as we have here, particularly with this stunning Lagoon blue paintwork. Yes, I just said blue. Tell me if you think it's blue, because I'm pretty sure this looks green. It is one of MG's fabled monogram colours, special edition paints that they did to draw a little bit of interest, and I have to say, I quite like. Anyway, what is it that I love about these cars so much? Why am I so smitten with them that despite the fact I get to play with all sorts of lovely stuff all the time, I have not just asked to drive one of these, but I've bought one myself? And why haven't you seen it yet? Well, let me answer all of these things. The why I'm interested in these cars can be answered with a tale of two people. First, a very good friend of mine called Simon. He was my gaffer. In film and TV world, that's the head of the lighting department. So he worked with me on a number of projects, and I would say is one of the best friends I made out of my entire filmmaking experience. A chap I still talk to today, and will be sending this video. He had a Dodo Lanos, which was his first car, and then, as these things do, after a little while, it fell apart. He came to me seeking something to replace it and wanted something a little bit sportier but still on a budget. We went to my local independent car garage who had a lockup with a number of cars, about a dozen or so. In that yard was a ZR105, and it seemed to be exactly the thing that we were after. A nice step up from a Dodo Lanos, but still not too crazy a car that it was going to be difficult or expensive to insure. Remember, Simon and myself were both young and in the film industry. Not exactly easy to insure that. We took the car out for a test drive. All seemed generally okay. It had a silly loud exhaust on it and the same Lexus style lights that mine does, which actually came from the much later model. And on the way back I put my foot on the brake and the car completely cut out. We pushed it the last few hundred yards back to the garage and for some reason still bought it. It turned out that the problem was the battery simply hadn't been screwed in properly and moved when we put our foot on the brake, disconnecting all of the electrics. The reason that it was being sold there was that the previous owner had had a head gasket failure and couldn't afford to fix it, so the garage bought it off them, did the head gasket and then sold it. Though truthfully it was only ever intended as a brief stopgap, that car stayed with Simon for the best part of a decade, during which time he moved from the countryside into London, where still it continued to be a faithful companion until eventually it got just a little bit too expensive to keep on the road. It is a car we both remember very fondly. I think I actually only ever drove it once or maybe twice because of insurance restrictions at the time. Again, we were young. The second person in the story, and a much more recent addition, is one Paul Roverman, not his actual name. He runs a YouTube channel called Project Nigel, and after I'd rediscovered my love of the ZS, piped up and said, hey, do you want to drive my Rover 25, the multicoloured patchwork affair that it is? I went out, drove it, and must admit, I was instantly smitten. And I thought, crikey, if the 25 is this good, the ZR must be great. MG knew their target audience to a T. They wanted to get on the side of the yob. And they did. They threw deals at it left, right and centre. We pay the VAT, we give you free insurance, all that stuff. You could buy one of these new for just over £10,000. Even then, that wasn't masses of money. My ZR160 cost its original owner just over 14, and that was for a well-specified car. Okay, this doesn't exactly have a lot of poke, but neither really does the 160 until you get it going. The 120 is probably the torquiest and easiest of all to drive, and I'm told with some cams that actually may be the best engine of the lot. But this is the one that many people, including myself, do remember rather fondly. And it's certainly what you'd call a momentum car. You never want to brake, which is absolutely fine because the brakes here are not brilliant. Discs at the front, drums at the back. Higher spec models got discs all round and larger ones too. Naturally, it's been fitted with the obligatory aftermarket exhaust, so it sounds far faster than it is, I assure you. It's the handling of this thing which is its real USP. The steering feel in here is delightful. No, not the best ever. It can't hold a candle to, say, a Lotus Elise. There's a bit of a wobble coming through this, but I'm 99% certain this has a binding caliper. One of the issues which is keeping my own car off the road. This one is nowhere near as bad though. See what I mean? But there's a weight, there's a feel, there's a tactility to this steering. The front end communicates so well, and because the car doesn't really have any power at all, the fact it's got no traction control is really not a concern. Even today, where it's pretty miserable, you put your foot down and you're fine. That's foot down, by the way. I mean, talk amongst yourselves. I'll get it to the red line eventually. To give you some context to the performance, 0 to 60 for these was quoted as, I think, high 9s. The gearbox here also isn't brilliant. There's a lot of play in this one, but I do know that it can be a lot better. Fuel economy in these is also generally reasonable. You'll get 30s to 40s out of it if driven gently. If driven like most of them were, not quite that much. It does make a good noise though, I have to say. That little K-series is a sweet, sweet lump. And sure, the seating position is a little bit weird. You feel at all times perched far too high. How Rafe, this car's owner, at 6'8" gets on, I do not know. I'm 5'10". I did see him get in this car, and it was like watching a basketball player thread himself into a Mini. But like I said, this wasn't a car bought for him, it was bought for a 17-year-old. He himself drives a number of different things, including an old Mercedes-Benz 124 and a Vauxhall Monaro. Like myself though, he said that it had been a while since he got behind the wheel of this. He got in it and immediately he was reminded of just how fun and engaging the whole package is. It does genuinely make you feel a little bit younger because you remember this is how things were. Like going and playing an old video game, you think you're older and better, so it's gonna be easy, but it's not. Likewise, these actually handled really well. And they still do. But more than that, modern cars, particularly in this class, have just gotten very aloof, very easy, very light. Everything in them has no feel or feedback whatsoever. That's what the market demands. But this was made in a very, very different time. And today, it's the fact that it is really an older platform that's actually one of its greatest strengths. All right, I know. I'm starting to sound a little bit evangelical, aren't I? Do these things have problems? Yeah, sure they do. Like I said, corrosion, that's a big problem. Not so much on the main structure, but all of the panels seem to like going. Front wings in particular, around the boot lock, at the back, the sills, the wheel arches, the whole lot. The interior was a constant source of mockery for the MG ZR, ZS and the Rover equivalents. I can see why. It's not exactly high-end in here. These half-leather seats are actually quite decent. They do hug you, though they lack the adjustment you really require. They will go up and down, but not down anywhere near as much as you think. I appreciate the fact this car has a sunroof, though note, it may have come at the cost of the air conditioning, which for the 105 was not standard. On the 160, it is. One oddity of this car, the difference between first and second gear is enormous. Just there I was trying to get up a hill in second, which should be easy in anything, and this really struggled at 15 mile an hour. The higher spec cars actually had closer ratio boxes, which for the motorway is more annoying, but actually made them considerably more spry for this kind of thing. Naturally, this being a bit lower and stiffer than the 25 isn't quite as comfortable, and it's got a bit of a jitter about it, but I would say the ride actually is quite well judged. The biggest problem with this car is the amount that it rattles, because that makes it feel like it's riding a lot less plushly than it actually is. Compared to many a modern day hot hatch, this is really quite comfy. The boot of my own car I currently can't get into because for some reason the latch at the back has failed. This actually happened to Simon, so when it happened to me, I just laughed. The fix is not particularly expensive, but it's also a bit fiddly because you do have to crawl into the car to be able to access the bits you need to get to. I have known a couple of people MacGyver a solution to that by looping a rope around the cable that releases the boot, dragging it through to the front, and then when you need to get into the back, and you're in. Yeah, the head gaskets go, and though it isn't a hugely expensive job, it is in the context of one of these. When you're only paying maybe a couple of grand for a car, a £400 or £500 bill is a big one, and that realistically is what it can cost to do a head gasket. I have heard figures quite a bit lower than that from some places, but today I'd be fairly confident that any of these still out there with reasonable miles on the clock will probably have been done already. And generally speaking, if they've been done, they'll have been done with a better uprated part that should last a hell of a lot longer. The gearboxes, though generally good, are not immune to their own issues and can require a rebuild. That again is not going to be cheap. If rust has taken hold, you need to start replacing wings and the like, doing paintwork. That again will add up. The cam belt does require doing, again at intervals that may be shorter than you're used to. Budget again, another few £100s. That being said, the cam belt aside, general servicing and maintenance on these is extremely reasonable. They're not expensive cars to keep going while they're working. And this brings me on to the crux of the matter, and really, for me, the biggest single problem with the MG ZR today. The fact is, these are and were always a very cheap car. As the company began to falter under the Phoenix 4, their solution was things like Project Drive. Rather than trying to make the cars better or introduce new ones, let's just take the existing models and make them even cheaper. It was sadly a very short-term solution. Even the facelift really simply wasn't enough. Sure, the cars looked new, but the moment you got in them, you realised they were actually just as cheap and nasty, if not worse, than ever before. By the time MG Rover folded, they were selling a car based on a 10-year-old platform, and nobody really was fooled. You can make it as cheap as you like, but it wasn't any better than it ever had been. This is another thing I love about these cars. They're so small and narrow because of that high seating position. You've got great visibility. You can thread this car through the narrowest of gaps. For roads like this, it's brilliant. And here's the thing, though it actually started as the cheapest of the MG lineup, today it's actually one of the more desirable because I think this is the car that most people have fond memories of. But sadly, in the 2 decades since these cars were new, very few people have actually cared for them properly because they were bought as cheap cars and therefore run as cheap cars. It didn't take long at all before these were worth only a couple of grand. Even today, with prices actually better than they ever have been, you're still looking at paying maybe £1,000 for an entry-level one of these, up to say £3,000 or £4,000 for what allegedly are the very best. But this is the problem. From what I can see, and maybe I'm getting things totally wrong here, MG ZRs being advertised come in only one of 2 variants. Cars where the owners are honest about the issues that they have, and cars where the owners are either oblivious, unaware, or dishonest about the problems that the cars have. I've seen a number of vehicles advertised one week as a, yeah sure, viable project, needs a little work but it'll be fine, and then the exact same car 2 weeks later being sold as totally shot, complete scrap, no good to man or beast. My own is currently sat on the driveway looking very, very sorry for itself because despite the fact when I picked it up, it had 4 tyres inflated to the perfect pressure, 2 days later I somehow appear to have acquired 4 slow punctures. It also has the aforementioned binding caliper, though that I think is genuinely a problem that occurred without the owner knowing because the car was stood for a very long time. I bought it because it's a genuine 3 previous owner, 27,000 mile example with some history, and that is something you just don't see in the MG ZR world. As a serial Lotus owner, I think really I was doomed to fall in love with these cars because they are very much an underdog and they steer brilliantly. They're also very usable day to day, rattly though they may be, that's factory standard, and sure, there'll be a lot of people out there that don't get it, but there are also a growing number of people out there who will. And the best thing about the MG Rover community is that not only are they a bunch of really friendly, decent people, but they also know the importance of keeping these cars on the road. And compared to, say, a Renault Sport Clio 182, sure, that car may be a little more powerful and, I can't believe I'm saying this, better built, but these do have a charm, and luckily most of the parts you need are not just available, but well priced too. However, if I managed to convince you to take a look at one of these, I would say do your research, read up on the common issues that these suffer from. There's plenty of guides out there about them. Buy wisely, try and buy from an enthusiast, someone that knows the car. Try and find one with a reasonable history folder, and then even though you will be spending on it, hopefully you won't be spending on things you didn't need to. With just about any ZR out there, I would say realistically, budget between £1,000 to £2,000 on top of your purchase price if you're the sort of person that, like me, wants the car to be just right. Sure, there are a few out there for about £1,000 that maybe you could run around and drive for about a year, but these are also the cars just on that cusp of being essentially scrap vehicles. In the long run, they're likely to wind up costing you a lot more than just buying a good one in the first place. But then, I've never really been someone to actually take my own advice, so I don't necessarily expect you to. However, I want to say a big thanks to Rafe for bringing this out. I've thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.